A quiet afternoon in a small town suddenly turns chaotic. An elderly black woman, minding her own business, finds herself in a confrontation with the police, her only crime, existing in a space that some people believe she doesn't belong. The officers' voices are harsh, their actions ruthless, but she doesn't back down. Instead, she reaches for her phone and dials a number. The voice on the other end isn't just any voice, it's a call for help from someone who's trained to deal with the unthinkable. What happens next will shake you to the core. How far will a mother go to protect herself? And who exactly is her son? Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are listening. Your support means everything. The sun was setting over the quiet town of Greenfield, casting long shadows down the streets as Eleanor sat on her porch, rocking gently in her chair. At 72, life had taught her the value of peace. After all, she'd earned it, the years of raising her children, the hardships of the civil rights movement, the long hours spent at a factory that never quite valued her contributions. But none of that mattered now. Now, she lived for moments like these, watching the world slow down, breathing in the crisp evening air, feeling the weight of the years lift with each deep breath. Eleanor was known in the neighborhood. People called her Mama Eleanor because she'd spent decades looking after the children, always offering a word of wisdom or a warm meal to anyone who needed it. She loved her community, and they loved her back. That afternoon, she had just returned from the local market, her grocery bags filled with vegetables for the stew she'd planned to make. She greeted her neighbors with a smile, her dark skin glowing in the golden light, her silver-streaked hair tied in a neat bun. She was a fixture in this town, nothing out of the ordinary, but the peace was fragile. As she unloaded her groceries onto the porch, Eleanor noticed something odd: a police car slowly cruising past her house. She'd seen the officers before, but there was a different energy this time, a subtle shift in the air. She shook it off. It was probably nothing. Eleanor had lived long enough to know the way some people looked at her. How they whispered when she walked into certain rooms, or how their eyes would linger just a little too long, tracing the color of her skin. But she didn't let it get to her. It wasn't her problem, she'd always told herself. Not anymore. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon, that feeling she couldn't shake grew stronger. The car had passed twice now, and this time, it slowed even more. Eleanor stood up from her rocking chair, a slight furrow in her brow. She wasn't used to feeling uneasy. Her years of experience had taught her how to sense trouble before it arrived, but this time, she couldn't put her finger on it. Just then, the car stopped. The officers, two white men in uniform, got out. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. One of them, Officer Harris, she recognized. He'd been part of the force for a few years, but their interactions had always been brief, never more than a polite exchange of words. The other officer, a younger man she'd never seen before, stood a little too stiffly, his eyes scanning the neighborhood. Eleanor didn't flinch. She knew the game. She knew what was coming. "Afternoon, ma'am," Officer Harris called out as they approached, his voice unusually firm. "Afternoon," Eleanor replied, standing her ground, though a knot began to form in her stomach. She had no reason to fear, but something in the way they stood together, blocking her path, set her on edge. "We've had some complaints about a disturbance in this area," Officer Harris continued. His words were matter of fact, but there was a slight, almost imperceptible edge to his tone. "You wouldn't happen to have noticed anything unusual, would you?" Eleanor's mind raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "No, officer," she said, her voice steady. "It's been a peaceful afternoon. I'm just finishing up my groceries." The younger officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked her up and down. Eleanor felt his gaze like a weight pressing on her shoulders. "Just a routine check, Mum," Officer Harris said, his voice now colder. "We're just making sure everything's in order." Eleanor looked from one officer to the other, trying to read their faces. She knew better than to trust the friendliness of their words. In all her years, she'd seen this play out too many times: the slow escalation, the unfair questioning, the quiet assumption that someone who looked like her was out of place out without warning. Officer Harris took a step closer, his gaze narrowing as he studied her. "I'm going to need to see some ID." "Ma'am," he said, his voice now sharper. Eleanor's chest tightened. She could feel the familiar stirrings of something all too well known, something she'd fought against for years. The injustice that came with being a black woman in America was not always loud, but it was always there, just beneath the surface. And today, it was surfacing once again. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "I'm just a woman trying to enjoy my evening." The younger officer stepped forward, his hand moving toward his belt. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The thin, invisible line that had separated her from danger had just been crossed. And that was when she knew it was time to call her son. The one person who wouldn't let them get away with this. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she dialed Jason's number. She didn't want to feel afraid. She'd lived through the darkest of times and had come out stronger on the other side. But this was something different. This was happening in her own neighborhood, in the twilight of her years. And it felt like the past was rushing back to remind her that she wasn't safe. Not truly. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before Jason's deep voice broke through the line. "Mom, what's going on?" Eleanor exhaled, trying to steady her breathing. "I need you, Jason," she said, her voice firm despite the nervousness creeping in. "There's trouble here, police trouble. They're harassing me, and I'm not sure what they'll do next." Her son didn't hesitate. "Where are you?" "I'm at home on the porch." "Just hurry. I'm on my way, Mom. Stay calm." The line went silent, and Eleanor lowered the phone, holding it tightly in her hand as she turned to face the officers. She didn't have to wait long for the situation to escalate. Officer Harris and his younger partner were still standing on her porch, their body language shifting from cautious politeness to something more ominous. "I asked you for ID." "Ma'am," Officer Harris repeated, his voice now edged with impatience. His eyes never left her face, like a predator sizing up its prey. "I expect you to comply." Eleanor stood tall, her spine straightening as she locked eyes with him. "I told you, I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice steady, even as her heart pounded in her chest. "I'm not going to just hand over my ID because you tell me to. You've got no reason to question me." The younger officer stepped closer, his tone sneering. "We've got every right. You're being incooperative, ma'am. Incooperative." The word hit her like a slap. She'd seen this before, heard this before. The way they always twisted the story made it her fault for standing her ground. But this time, she wouldn't be silenced. "Not by them, not by anyone. I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice low, but carrying the weight of years of frustration. "I've lived here longer than either of you have. I'm not scared of you." The younger officer took a step forward, and Eleanor braced herself, ready for whatever would come next. But just then, the unmistakable sound of a car engine roared down the street. Jason was here. Eleanor felt a flash of relief, but the officers didn't. The fear on their faces was palpable now as they looked down the road. The car came to a screeching halt right in front of her house, and out stepped her son, Jason, tall, strong, wearing the no-nonsense look of someone who had faced down danger time and again. He didn't hesitate, striding toward them, his uniform a sharp contrast to the officer's faded blue. Jason's eyes locked onto the younger officer. Without a word, he stepped in between his mother and the officers, placing himself firmly in front of her. "Back off," Jason said, his voice calm but edged with authority. "She's done nothing wrong." Officer Harris, flustered, sputtered. "This doesn't concern you, sir." I'm her son," Jason interrupted, his tone low but unwavering. "And I suggest you let her go, before this gets out of hand." The younger officer's hand twitched again, but Jason didn't flinch. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough. The officers had dealt with many situations, many people, but they hadn't dealt with Jason. They hadn't faced someone who had been trained to handle much worse. The officers were backing away, their eyes darting from Jason's determined stance to the car idling on the curb. But the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it had only grown more charged, like the electric hum just before a storm breaks. Eleanor felt her pulse pounding in her ears. She could see the officers' faces, still unsure of what to do, who to answer to. Jason stood tall and yielding, but the sirens had only gotten louder. The police presence wasn't just about intimidation anymore, it was becoming a public spectacle. This wasn't just Eleanor's fight anymore. It was bigger, and it was about to explode into the open. Just then, the screech of another car filled the air, louder than the sirens this time. It wasn't just a car. It was a black SUV, pulling up quickly in front of her house. Eleanor's heart skipped, then raced again. It wasn't Jason's car. She turned her head and saw a man stepping out of the vehicle, dressed sharply, his demeanor cold and confident. His presence commanded attention, and for a moment, the officers froze. "Jason, Mom, what's going on here?" The voice was deep, smooth, with a tone that carried authority. Eleanor blinked. It took her a moment to register who it was, and then the realization hit like a freight train. It was her lawyer, Sean Mitchell, the one who had been fighting for her civil rights for years. The one who had helped her sue for discrimination years ago when a job offer was rescinded simply because she was black. Sean wasn't just her lawyer, he was a powerhouse. A man who had won battles against corrupt systems and institutions. His name was known, and he wasn't someone the officers could just push around. But it wasn't just that. Sean was one of the most well-connected lawyers in the state. He had connections in the media, in the courts, and most importantly, in the very departments that these officers worked for. With him, the power dynamic shifted in an instant. Jason nodded as Sean approached, his presence instantly altering the situation. The officers stiffened. Sean's gaze was unwavering as he locked eyes with Officer Harris, who suddenly looked like he had been caught in a trap. "You too," Sean said, pointing toward the officers, his voice like ice. "I think you're misunderstanding the situation here. You've detained this woman, my client, on no grounds. You've insulted her, and now you're about to escalate things further by detaining her unlawfully. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to make sure you leave now." The following weeks were a whirlwind. What started as a quiet confrontation on the porch had transformed into a public reckoning. Eleanor had never imagined that the calm she'd long sought would come in the form of headlines and news stories. But after that fateful encounter, the story spread like wildfire on social media, in local news outlets, and eventually, on national platforms. Eleanor's lawyer, Sean, wasn't just focused on getting the officers off her back. He was determined to make sure the world knew what had happened. The viral videos of the altercation, filmed by concerned neighbors, became the centerpiece of a larger conversation about racial profiling, police brutality, and the systemic inequalities that plagued so many communities. And it wasn't just Eleanor who was watching it unfold, it was everyone who had ever felt silenced, whose existence had been made to feel less than, who had faced the quiet sting of racial discrimination every day. The officers, once so sure of their authority, found themselves facing severe consequences. Officer Harris was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The younger officer, less experienced but complicit, was placed under scrutiny as well. It wasn't just about what happened that day, it was about a culture of mistreatment and bias, a culture that the community had silently endured for far too long. Eleanor's case wasn't just a personal fight, it was a fight for all the voices that had been dismissed, ignored, or oppressed. It was a reminder that standing up to injustice could create ripples that reached far beyond any one person, and the ripple effect didn't stop there. A few months later, the city council held a public meeting to discuss police reform, triggered by the uproar over the incident. The officers involved were given mandatory retraining, but Eleanor's voice, empowered by Sean's tireless advocacy, had sparked more. The mayor even addressed the systemic issue of racial bias within law enforcement, acknowledging that it wasn't enough to simply condemn individual actions, it was time to overhaul systems that allowed such actions to thrive unchecked. Eleanor, who had once been content to simply live out her days in peace, found herself thrust into a new role. She was invited to speak at community forums, on news channels, and at rallies. Her face became a symbol of resistance, not because she sought the attention, but because her fight had tapped into something larger than herself. Her quiet defiance had awakened something in others, and they too were ready to stand tall. Jason, always a quiet force, watched it all unfold. He'd come home that day ready to protect his mother, but what had started as a personal battle had transformed into a national movement. He wasn't the only one protecting her anymore. His mother had become a symbol of the fight for fairness, for dignity, for respect. And seeing her stand up, seeing her use her voice, had changed something in him too. But the journey wasn't without its setbacks. Not everyone in the community supported the changes. Some whispered about too much attention, or too much noise, but Eleanor had learned long ago that silence, when faced with injustice, was complicity. And she wasn't going to be complicit anymore. The long-term consequences for the officers were more than just job losses or disciplinary actions. The deeper consequence, the one they hadn't seen coming, was the spotlight on their behavior, the awareness it raised about systemic racism. The story had forced the entire city to look inward. It had forced people to question not just the officers' actions, but the underlying structures that allowed them to act without consequence. And that wasn't something easily undone. It was like a scar that, while it might fade, would never fully disappear. But the real impact, the real takeaway, wasn't just about holding individuals accountable. It was about the collective awakening that followed. It was about the realization that change wasn't something that came from waiting for someone else to act. It came from standing up, from speaking out, from confronting the uncomfortable truths head-on. And when people spoke, when they acted, they could bring about a change that was both profound and long-lasting. For Eleanor, the battle wasn't won in the headlines, but in the quiet moments of empowerment she now saw in herself and others. Her fight wasn't just about the officers, it was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had ever been silenced, who had ever been made to feel less than. And that fight, as it turned out, was just the beginning. As Eleanor stood before a crowd at a local community center months later, she looked out at the faces before her, faces of every color, every age. She saw the young people, the elders, the mothers, the fathers, all united in a single purpose. And for the first time, she felt an overwhelming sense of hope. A human spirit, Eleanor knew, was unbreakable. And together, they could move mountains. Change doesn't come easy, she said to the crowd, her voice steady and strong, but it always comes. It's not about fighting alone. It's about standing together, finding strength in each other, and demanding what's ours, what's right. Her words hung in there like a declaration, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. Eleanor had fought for what was right, and now, it was time for all of them to do the same. And in that moment, the future didn't seem so uncertain anymore.